October 1942, El Alamein, Egypt. The sand carried the smell of burning oil and cordite. Bernard Montgomery stood in his command tent, map table covered with reconnaissance photographs. 3 days into the offensive, Rommel's Afrika Korps was bleeding, but so was 8th Army. The telephone rang. Cairo. The Prime Minister's voice came through the static. Churchill wanted results. Faster. He wanted Montgomery to throw the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, into a frontal assault against the German anti-tank screen. Breakthrough now. End it today. Montgomery listened. He did not interrupt. When Churchill finished, Montgomery spoke 7 words that would define their relationship for the rest of the war. "I will not do it, Prime Minister." Silence on the line. No British general had spoken to Churchill like this, not since Dunkirk. The Prime Minister had sacked commanders for less, far less. Montgomery continued. His voice was flat, clinical. "The 7th Armored is not a hammer. It is a scalpel. I will use it when the enemy is cut open, not before." Churchill's response is recorded in the war diary of Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Brigadier Francis de Guingand. The PM went quiet for nearly 30 seconds. Then he said, "Very well, Monty, but I expect results within the week," and hung up. What Churchill did not know, what almost no one outside Montgomery's inner circle knew, was why the 7th Armored had become so valuable, why Montgomery refused to spend it on a frontal assault. The answer lay in a series of intelligence reports that had arrived over the previous 6 weeks, reports that made no military sense. German airfields behind Rommel's lines were being destroyed, not by bombers. The RAF had not authorized any raids. The airfields were simply gone. Aircraft burned on the ground, fuel dumps exploded, pilots found dead in their tents. Rommel's supply convoys were vanishing in the desert. No contact, no distress signals. Just empty trucks found days later riddled with bullet holes, their cargo missing or destroyed. And the strangest detail of all? German signals intelligence reported radio transmissions in perfect German, giving false orders. Entire units diverted to locations where no enemy existed, sent into ambushes. Montgomery had read these reports with growing interest. Someone was waging a different kind of war behind Rommel's lines, a war of shadows and sabotage. Before we continue, subscribe. We tell stories from World War II that ask uncomfortable questions about war, command, and what leaders owe to the men they send to die. In September 1942, a young staff officer named Captain Bill Stirling arrived at Montgomery's headquarters with a proposal. He was the brother of David Stirling, founder of a unit called the Special Air Service, and a formidable officer in his own right, already known in certain circles as the quieter, sharper mind behind the SAS's original conception. David was still in the field, still operational, still the face of the regiment in the North African theater. Bill had a different role. He was the man who understood how the whole thing worked logistically, doctrinally, and politically. He knew which battles were being won and which were being obscured, and he had come to make sure the right people understood the difference. There was a quality to Bill Stirling that Montgomery recognized immediately. He did not perform. He did not arrive with the burnished urgency of a man who needed something. He arrived with the composed directness of a man who had thought carefully about what he was about to say and had decided that facts were sufficient. In an army culture that rewarded a certain kind of confident theater, the sweeping gesture at the map, the ringing declaration, Stirling's understatement was almost startling. He laid his materials on the table without ceremony. Before and after reconnaissance images of German airfields. The before showed neat rows of Messerschmitts and Junkers. The after showed craters and wreckage. He brought numbers. In the previous 12 months, this unit of fewer than 100 men had destroyed well over 250 aircraft on the ground, more than the entire Royal Air Force had managed in the same theater. He brought the supply chain analysis. He brought the German signals intercepts that showed Rommel's logistics officers filing damage reports they couldn't explain. He brought the pattern, spread across 6 weeks of intelligence, of an army slowly being bled by something it could not see, and therefore could not stop. Montgomery studied the photographs for a long time. He did not speak until he had looked at every image. Then he asked a single question. What do they need? The answer was simple. They needed the 7th Armored Division to stay intact, to stay mobile, to create the kind of fluid battlefield where small units could slip through the lines, strike deep, and disappear. A frontal assault, the kind Churchill wanted, would fix the battle lines, freeze them into static positions, turn the Desert War into another Western front. And a static front was a front where small raiding parties could not survive. The SAS lived in the gaps between formations, in the open desert between the German forward positions and their rear echelons, in the ambiguous geography where nobody was quite sure who controlled the ground. Close those gaps with a conventional offensive, and you close the theater that the SAS required to operate, and that would end the SAS. Montgomery understood something that Churchill, for all his strategic brilliance, had missed. The Desert War was not being won by divisions. It was being won by ghosts. The war diary of the Afrika Korps, captured after Rommel's retreat, contains a remarkable entry from October 15, 1942. A German logistics officer named Major Hans Richter wrote, "We have lost 37 aircraft in the past week, not to enemy fighters, not to bombers. They simply burn in the night. The men speak of Wüstengespenster, desert ghosts. Command insists there is no organized force behind our lines, but the fuel dumps continue to explode. The convoys continue to vanish." Richter was wrong about only one thing. There was an organized force. It was simply too small, too fast, and too unconventional to fit into German military categories. The SAS operated in jeeps modified with twin Vickers machine guns, 4 men per vehicle. They navigated by stars and compass, crossing hundreds of miles of desert that German maps marked as impassable. They struck at night. They never engaged in stand-up fights. They disappeared before dawn. What made them dangerous was not merely the destruction they caused. Any sufficiently determined raiding party can destroy things. What made the SAS something different was the economy of it, the ratio between effort and effect, between the number of men risked and the strategic consequence delivered. A patrol of 4 men and 2 jeeps, operating 300 miles behind the front, could ground an entire Luftwaffe squadron for a week. That same 4 men, fed into a conventional infantry attack, would be 4 riflemen advancing toward a defended position. The arithmetic was not subtle, and they were making Rommel's logistics impossible. Every gallon of fuel the Afrika Korps received had to travel over 1,000 miles, by ship to Tripoli, then by truck across the desert to the front. The desert itself was the first enemy. The distances were punishing, the roads were poor, and the heat consumed fuel simply getting the fuel to where it was needed. Against this already strained system, the SAS had set themselves as a standing tax. Every convoy that moved at night moved with the possibility of ambush. Every airfield that kept its lights on kept them on with the knowledge that the darkness beyond the perimeter was not necessarily empty. Montgomery knew the mathematics. For every ton of supplies Rommel received, he was losing 3 tons to raids and ambushes. The Desert Fox was starving. His tanks were running on fumes. His pilots were sleeping in their cockpits with pistols in their laps. His supply officers were writing reports that used the word disappeared in contexts that had no military precedent. A frontal assault with the 7th Armoured might break through. It might also fail. Either way, it would cost Montgomery his mobile reserve and his ability to exploit the chaos that the SAS was creating behind German lines. The choice was between a single large gamble with uncertain odds and a slow accumulation of certainty, paid for in patience. Churchill was temperamentally disposed toward the large gamble. Montgomery was temperamentally disposed toward certainty. So he told Churchill no. What would you have done in his place? The relationship between Montgomery and Churchill was never warm after that phone call. The Prime Minister was not a man who accepted defiance gracefully. He had fired generals before, Auchinleck, Wavell, others, for far smaller acts of insubordination. But Montgomery delivered something none of those other generals had managed. He delivered victory. El Alamein ended on November 11, 1942. Rommel's army was broken, not just defeated, shattered. The Afrika Korps retreated westward, bleeding men and equipment at every step, and the SAS followed them. The retreat west was not a clean disengagement. Rommel was a commander of exceptional skill, and he managed the withdrawal with a professionalism that prevented the rout from becoming an annihilation. But the SAS did not let the retreating columns move in peace. They hit the fuel convoys, trying to keep the panzer divisions mobile. They mined the roads at night and were gone before dawn. They struck the airfields at the rear, where replacement aircraft were being positioned to cover the withdrawal. The Afrika Korps moved westward through a landscape that had become hostile in a way that German doctrine had not prepared it for. Not the clean hostility of an enemy firing line, but the pervasive, sourceless hostility of a theater where the rear was as dangerous as the front. The official British history of the campaign mentions the Special Air Service in 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs out of 400 pages. The destruction of hundreds of aircraft warrants a footnote. The systematic demolition of Rommel's supply network receives a single sentence. This was not an accident. Montgomery himself insisted on minimizing their role in official accounts. Unconventional forces, he wrote in a private memo to the War Office, must remain unconventional. Their effectiveness depends on the enemy not understanding what they face. It was a principle that had practical military logic and also something else, a kind of institutional modesty that was unusual coming from Montgomery, who was not known for self-effacement. But he understood that the SAS's most valuable asset was not the men or the jeeps or the Vickers guns. It was the enemy's uncertainty about what they faced. An enemy that understood the SAS could prepare for it, could deploy heavier security forces, could move convoys in daylight with fighter cover. An enemy that did not understand what it faced could only stare at the smoke rising from burned aircraft and wonder. Montgomery wanted to keep them wondering. But Rommel understood. In his papers, discovered after the war, the field marshal wrote a detailed assessment of the factors that led to his defeat at El Alamein. Air superiority, naval interdiction of supplies, Montgomery's operational patience, and one other factor which Rommel underlined twice. The British have developed a new form of warfare. Small units operating independently, striking our rear areas with impunity. We have no effective counter. Our security forces are too slow, too heavy, too conventional. These raiders are not soldiers in any traditional sense. They are hunters. Rommel recommended the creation of similar German units. The recommendation was rejected by Berlin. The Wehrmacht's doctrine did not allow for such improvisation. Montgomery's refusal to sacrifice the 7th Armored was not just about preserving a division, it was about preserving a way of fighting that the Germans could not match. The Desert Rats would go on to fight in Italy and France. They would be among the first British units to cross the Rhine, but their most important contribution may have been the battles they never fought, the frontal assaults Montgomery refused to order, keeping them mobile and dangerous. And behind them, always behind them, the ghosts of the SAS continued their work. By December 1942, British intelligence estimated that Rommel had lost more vehicles to SAS raids than to direct combat with 8th Army. The number was almost certainly an undercount. Many German losses were never reported. Convoys simply disappeared, their fate unknown. Major Richter, the German logistics officer, survived the war. He spent 2 years in British captivity after the fall of Tunisia and then returned to Germany, where he eventually found work in freight management, a career choice that his former comrades found either logical or perverse, depending on their temperament. In a 1956 interview with a British military historian, he was asked about the desert ghosts he had written about in his diary. "We knew someone was out there," he said. "We could feel it. Every night men would stare into the darkness, waiting for the explosions. It was not the losses that broke us. It was the uncertainty. We never knew where they would strike. We never knew if we were safe. That fear, that constant grinding fear, was worse than the casualties." He paused for a long time before adding something the historian noted, but almost did not include. "The worst nights were the quiet ones," Richter said, "when nothing happened. Because you spent the whole night waiting for something to happen, and then it didn't, and you felt relief. And then you realized that the relief was exactly what they wanted you to feel. They were training you to be afraid of the silence." Montgomery knew this. He had not invented psychological warfare, but he understood it with unusual precision. The purpose of the SAS raids was not simply to destroy German aircraft and fuel. Destruction was the method. The purpose was to make the Afrika Korps uncertain, to introduce into the daily life of every German soldier in the theater a baseline level of apprehension that would degrade judgment, reduce initiative, and consume command attention that should have been directed elsewhere. Rommel was a general who depended on tempo, on the exploitation of confusion, on rapid decisions made under pressure. Montgomery was methodically introducing confusion into Rommel's rear while eliminating it from his own front. He had built his entire strategy around it. When Churchill demanded the 7th Armored, he was thinking like a conventional general: mass, firepower, decisive engagement. Montgomery was thinking about something more subtle. He was thinking about the psychological destruction of an army. The Afrika Korps did not collapse in a single battle. It collapsed over weeks of slow, relentless bleeding. Every burned aircraft, every ambushed convoy, every false radio order sent German commanders into spirals of paranoia and confusion, and Montgomery protected the men who made it possible. Even at the cost of defying the Prime Minister, the 7th Armored Division suffered heavy casualties later in the war. Many of its veterans did not survive to see Germany's surrender, but they were spent in battles that Montgomery judged worthwhile, not thrown away in frontal assaults to satisfy political impatience. This was the bargain Montgomery struck. He would accept Churchill's anger. He would accept the whispered accusations of timidity. He would accept being called slow, cautious, unimaginative. In exchange, he would win. The SAS continued operating throughout the war. Their methods evolved, their targets changed, but the principle remained the same. Small forces operating behind enemy lines, creating effects far out of proportion to their numbers. By 1945, the unit that David Stirling had founded with 67 men had grown into a brigade. Its veterans went on to train special forces across the Western Alliance. The tactics developed in the North African desert became the foundation for a new kind of warfare. David Stirling himself would be captured in Tunisia in January 1943, a few months after El Alamein, and would spend the rest of the war in Colditz after a series of escape attempts that eventually exhausted even the Germans' patience. Command of the 1st SAS Regiment passed to Paddy Mayne, who proved to be a different kind of leader than Stirling. Quieter in some respects, more relentless in others. A man who led from the front in a way that worried his superiors and inspired a particular kind of devotion in the men who served under him. Bill Stirling, meanwhile, formed the 2nd SAS Regiment in the spring of 1943, taking the original SAS concept and applying it in the Italian and later the European theater. The two brothers had different temperaments and different methods. What they shared was an understanding of the asymmetric logic at the heart of special operations. That a small number of highly capable men, operating in conditions that conventional forces found impossible, could achieve effects that large formations could not. Montgomery understood this logic. He understood it, one might argue, better than either Stirling, because he understood it in the context of an entire army, rather than in the context of the special operations community alone. The SAS existed inside a larger strategic picture. Their effectiveness depended on the larger picture being managed correctly, on the front remaining fluid, on the enemy's attention remaining divided, on the conventional forces being used in a way that created and preserved the operational space the special forces needed to survive and function. Montgomery managed that picture. He was not a man who could have founded or commanded the SAS, but he was exactly the kind of man who could have recognized its value and protected it at the moment when protecting it required something most generals were unable or unwilling to do. None of this would have happened if Montgomery had obeyed Churchill's order. The decision had consequences beyond strategy. It reshaped how British commanders related to their political masters for the remainder of the war. Churchill never forgot the rebuke. In his memoirs, he mentioned Montgomery's North African campaign in measured tones, professional respect, carefully worded, notably lacking the warmth he reserved for other generals. Those who knew both men understood what lay beneath the surface. Brooke recorded a conversation from January 1945. Churchill had been drinking brandy, reviewing casualty reports from the Ardennes. American losses dominated the news. British forces had held their sectors without catastrophic sacrifice. The contrast was not comfortable for anyone in that room who understood what it implied. Brooke had his own complicated relationship with Montgomery. He admired him. He also spent considerable energy managing the political fallout of Montgomery's inability, or refusal, to be diplomatically careful with the feelings of allies and superiors. The Americans found Montgomery almost impossible. Eisenhower found him almost impossible. Even Alexander, who was constitutionally disinclined toward conflict of any kind, had moments of genuine exasperation. Brooke served as a kind of permanent diplomatic buffer between Montgomery and everyone else, and it was work that left him, by 1945, tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the job. But on the question of casualties, Brooke did not waver. He had been a young officer in the First World War. He carried those years with him the way all of them did. Not as trauma in any way they would have named it, but as a permanent recalibration of what was acceptable and what was not. The great sin of the Western Front had not been that men died. Men died in war. The great sin had been the indifference to the dying. The willingness of commanders in comfortable chateaus to send another 10,000 men toward the same wire that had stopped the previous 10,000, on the theory that eventually the wire would run out of war. Montgomery's refusal to do this was not, Brooke believed, timidity. It was memory. Monty keeps his men alive, Churchill said. The tone was ambiguous. Brooke couldn't tell if it was praise or criticism. He does, Prime Minister. And yet. Churchill let the sentence hang. I wonder sometimes if he remembers that wars must be won, not merely survived. Brooke chose his words carefully. He remembers Passchendaele, sir. He was there. He saw what happens when commanders forget that battles are fought by men with families. Churchill said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the casualty reports. He looked at the fire. Then he looked back at the reports. He had his own memories of the First World War, memories of a different kind, of the Dardanelles, of decisions that had cost him everything, of years spent rebuilding a reputation that had been destroyed in a single catastrophic miscalculation about what was possible. He understood, better than most, that certainty about what was militarily achievable was the most dangerous thing a politician could possess. He returned to his reports. Before we continue, subscribe. We tell stories from World War II that ask uncomfortable questions about war, justice, and human nature. The relationship between political leaders and military commanders would remain fraught throughout the war. Montgomery had established a principle. Field commanders bore ultimate responsibility for the lives entrusted to them. Politicians could set objectives. They could not dictate tactics that would waste those lives. This principle saved the 7th Armored Division. It also created tensions that would explode again during the arguments over Operation Market Garden, over the broad front versus narrow thrust debate, over who would command the final push into Germany. But that was later. In the summer and autumn of 1942, what mattered was that Montgomery had the authority to fight his way. The veterans of the Desert Rats carried their experience forward. By the time they landed in Normandy in June 1944, they were among the most battle-hardened units in the British Army. Their expertise in armored warfare, learned in the open spaces of North Africa, proved invaluable in the bocage country of France. Not because the terrain was similar, but because they understood what tanks could and couldn't do. Sergeant Thomas Wilkins, who had fought at El Alamein as a tank commander, wrote to his wife from a field hospital in September 1944. He had been wounded in the push toward Belgium. His letter survived in the Imperial War Museum collection. I keep thinking about the desert, he wrote, how close we came to being thrown away. The new lads don't know. They think the Army always valued us. But I remember when Montgomery arrived, I remember what he said, that he wouldn't sacrifice us for Churchill's timetable. What would have happened if Montgomery had obeyed? The question haunted military historians for decades. In 1978, a War College study attempted to model the alternative. Their conclusion was stark. A premature offensive in August 1942 would likely have failed. British forces were not yet strong enough to break Rommel's lines. The 7th Armored Division, committed piecemeal, would have suffered casualties exceeding 60%. The psychological impact on British morale would have been devastating. More importantly, the delay gave Montgomery time to prepare something else. The deception operations that convinced Rommel to expect the main attack in the wrong place. These operations required weeks to develop. They could not have been improvised. Operation Bertram, the deception plan for El Alamein, remains one of the most successful military deceptions of the war. Fake tanks made from canvas and wood, fake supply dumps assembled with deliberate visibility, fake radio traffic conducted with enough procedural accuracy to survive analysis. All of it designed to present Rommel with a picture that was consistent, credible, and wrong. The real weight of the offensive was in the north. The deception pointed south. By the time Rommel understood what was happening, his armor was positioned to respond to a threat that did not exist, and the actual breakthrough was already underway. This was not improvised. It required technical specialists, signal operators, construction units, and weeks of careful, coordinated effort. The canvas tanks had to weather enough to lose their newness. The fake supply dumps had to be built at a rate that suggested genuine logistical preparation. The radio traffic had to be seeded gradually into the German intelligence picture so that analysts would have a history to draw on, a pattern to trust. None of this could be rushed. All of it required time. None of this would have been possible without time. The deception required weeks. Montgomery's refusal bought those weeks. The cost of that refusal was political. Montgomery's relationship with Churchill never fully recovered. The Prime Minister supported him publicly, defended him against American criticism, advocated for his promotion, but the trust between them had been damaged. Field Marshal Alexander, who commanded the Mediterranean theater, once observed that Montgomery fought Churchill almost as hard as he fought Rommel. He meant it as criticism. Others saw it differently. The men of the 7th Armoured Division certainly saw it differently. In 1962, at a reunion of El Alamein veterans, an aging corporal raised a toast. The words were recorded by a journalist covering the event for a local newspaper. "To Monty," the corporal said, "who told Churchill to go to hell and brought us home." The room erupted in cheers. These were old men now, grandfathers, their battles decades behind them. But they remembered. They remembered being valued. They remembered being led by someone who would not spend their lives cheaply. This was Montgomery's legacy. Not the victory parades, not the medals, not the famous beret. His legacy was the principle he established, that soldiers are not expendable assets to be consumed according to political schedules. They are human beings whose lives have meaning beyond their military utility. It was a principle the British Army had forgotten in the trenches of the First World War. Montgomery, who had survived those trenches as a young officer, was determined that his generation would not repeat the mistake. He succeeded. The cost was his relationship with the Prime Minister. The benefit was that thousands of men came home who would otherwise have died in a premature offensive designed to satisfy Churchill's impatience. Looking back, we can see the pattern clearly. The best military commanders of the Second World War, on all sides, were those who resisted political pressure when that pressure would have wasted lives. The worst were those who obeyed orders they knew to be catastrophic. Montgomery was many things: arrogant, difficult, often infuriating to his allies and subordinates alike. But on this occasion, in this moment, he was right, and he was brave enough to say no. The desert rats fought on. They liberated towns in France, crossed the Rhine, pushed into Germany. By the war's end, the 7th Armoured Division had been in continuous combat longer than almost any other British unit. Their casualty lists were long, but they had been given the chance to fight intelligently, under commanders who valued their lives. Churchill died in 1965. Montgomery outlived him by 11 years, dying in 1976 at the age of 88. Neither man ever publicly discussed their confrontation over the 7th Armored Division. The documentary evidence emerged only later, in memoirs and archived papers. But the soldiers remembered, and their children remembered. And now, 8 decades later, the story survives. A reminder that even in total war, even against an enemy as brutal as Nazi Germany, there were men who drew lines, who said, "This far and no further," who refused to treat human beings as numbers on a casualty report. If you had been in Montgomery's position, facing the most powerful man in Britain, knowing your career hung on your answer, would you have said no? Would you have risked everything to save men whose names you didn't know? It is worth being honest about how difficult the question is. We tend, in retrospect, to make these decisions look easier than they were. Montgomery's refusal has the quality of righteousness in hindsight because we know he won, because we know the deception worked, because we know the SAS continued to bleed Rommel's supply lines through the autumn of 1942. But he did not know any of that in October when he told Churchill no. He knew only that he thought the plan was wrong, that he was willing to stake his career on that judgment, and that the career he was staking was the most important thing he had built across 30 years of professional life. That is what makes the decision worth thinking about. Not the outcome, which history settled, but the moment itself, the silence on the line, the 7 words, the weight of what came after. Write your answer in the comments. If you want more stories from World War II that don't offer easy answers, subscribe. The briefing ended at 22:47 hours. Montgomery stood alone in the map room for 11 minutes after Churchill's aircraft lifted off. The Prime Minister's cigar smoke still hung in the air, that particular blend, Cuban, the same smell that had filled the cabinet war rooms during the Blitz. Captain Henderson entered to collect the maps. "Sir, shall I—" "Leave them." Henderson hesitated at the door. He had been Montgomery's aide for 14 months. He had seen the general face Rommel's panzers at Alamein. He had watched him remain perfectly calm when ultra-intercepts revealed the Germans knew the D-Day beaches. But he had never seen this expression before. The Prime Minister seemed displeased, sir. Montgomery turned. His face had that peculiar stillness that preceded either fury or something worse. "Henderson, what do you know about the 7th Armored Division?" "The Desert Rats, sir. North Africa, decorated. Good men. Good men." Montgomery repeated the words as if testing their weight. 11,426 good men, to be precise, as of this morning's strength report. Henderson waited. The Prime Minister wanted them used as a blocking force at the Falaise Gap, directly in the path of 2 SS Panzer divisions attempting breakout. No armor support, no air cover until the following morning. Casualty estimates. Montgomery paused. Casualty estimates were not discussed. They did not need to be discussed. Everyone in that room knew. "And you refused, sir?" Montgomery looked at his aide. 23 years old, Cambridge before the war, had never seen his friends burn alive inside a tank. "I told Winston that if he wanted to give that order, he would have to relieve me of command first, and that I would make certain the newspapers knew why." Henderson's face went pale. "Sir, that's insubordination, possibly treason, almost certainly career-ending." Montgomery picked up his beret from the table. "Also the only correct answer. Before I continue, subscribe. We tell stories from World War II that ask uncomfortable questions about war, command, and the weight of decisions most of us will never have to make." 3 days later, the Falaise Gap closed anyway. Different units, different timing, higher ground. The SS divisions were destroyed piecemeal over 72 hours instead of in a single apocalyptic collision. The 7th Armored Division fought at Giel, at Geilenkirchen, at the Rhine crossing. They lost men. Of course they lost men. This was war. But they lost them in actions that had purpose, that had support, that had a chance. Montgomery never spoke of the incident publicly. Neither did Churchill. The official records show only that the Prime Minister visited 21st Army Group headquarters on August 14, 1944, for strategic consultations. But Henderson remembered. He remembered standing in that map room, watching Montgomery stare at the positions of 11,000 men he had just saved by destroying his relationship with the most powerful figure in British politics. He remembered the silence. He remembered the smell of Cuban tobacco. What he could not remember, no matter how hard he tried in the years that followed, was what Montgomery's face had looked like in that moment. Triumph? Relief? Fear? The memory refused to resolve into anything clear. September 1944. Henderson found himself explaining the incident to a fellow staff officer during a rare evening of relative quiet near Eindhoven. "So Montgomery just refused?" "He did. Refused Churchill? Directly? To his face?" "I was there." The other officer, a major named Blackwood, logistics, shook his head slowly. "I don't understand. How does a man do that? Churchill could have had him relieved, court-martialed, finished." Henderson opened his mouth to explain. He had been composing the explanation in his head for weeks. It involved duty. It involved the relationship between moral authority and military rank. It involved the specific weight of 11,000 lives against one career. But when he tried to speak, the words wouldn't arrange themselves properly. They felt like counters on a board, sliding around without ever forming a coherent pattern. "He just did," Henderson said finally. "I can't explain it better than that." "But what did he say, exactly?" Henderson told him what Montgomery had said, the exact words. Blackwood listened carefully, nodding. "That's it? That's it. That doesn't explain anything." "No," Henderson agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, somewhere in the Dutch darkness, artillery rumbled. The sound had become so constant that Henderson barely noticed it anymore. "Would you have done it?" Blackwood asked. "Refused, I mean. If you'd been him." Henderson thought about it seriously. He tried to imagine himself in that map room, facing Churchill's cold fury, knowing that his entire career, everything he had worked for since Sandhurst, hung on his next words. "I don't know," he said. "I honestly don't know." What would you have done? Would you have risked everything? Your career, your reputation, your place in history, to save men whose faces you had never seen? The war ended. Henderson went home. He had a wife now, Elizabeth, married in December 1945. They had a small house in Surrey, a garden that needed work, a future that seemed impossibly peaceful after 5 years of maps and casualty reports. He had spent 5 years in a world organized entirely around questions of life and death, where the decisions made in rooms like Montgomery's map room flowed outward into consequences that could be counted and placed in columns. Now he worked in insurance. The work was not unpleasant. It was, in its own way, also about risk and consequence. But the scale was different, and the consequences were different. And there were days when he sat at his desk in London and felt the vertiginous sensation of a man who had stood very close to something enormous and was now standing very far from it. One evening in the spring of 1946, Elizabeth asked him about the war. She had been patient, had not pressed, had allowed him his silences. But it had been almost a year, and she wanted to understand something of what her husband had experienced. "What was the most important moment?" she asked. "If you had to choose just one." Henderson thought about Alamein, about D-Day, about the Rhine crossing, where he had watched 1,000 aircraft pass overhead in the morning light, each one carrying men who might die within the hour. But what he found himself trying to describe was the map room, the smell of Churchill's cigar, Montgomery's face refusing to resolve into any expression Henderson could name. "There was a moment," he began. "A meeting. Montgomery and Churchill." Elizabeth waited. Churchill wanted something. Montgomery refused. What did Churchill want? He wanted... Henderson stopped. He had explained this to Blackwood. He had explained it to himself dozens of times in the years since. But somehow, sitting in his Surrey garden with his wife beside him, the explanation wouldn't come. "Men would have died," he said finally. "Many men." And Montgomery said, "No." "That's good, isn't it, that he said no?" "Yes, I think so, yes." "Then why do you look like that?" Henderson didn't know how he looked. He only knew that he couldn't explain what he had witnessed, couldn't convey the weight of it, the terror, the strange moral vertigo of watching one man refuse another man's order and knowing that both of them were right in their own ways, and that the only difference was that one of them was willing to lose everything. "I can't explain it," he said. "I was there and I saw it happen, and I still can't explain it." Elizabeth took his hand. She didn't ask again. Montgomery lived until 1976, Churchill until 1965. Neither of them ever spoke publicly about the meeting of August 14th, 1944. Henderson found Montgomery's obituary in the Times on a March morning, 32 years after the war. He read it carefully, looking for some mention of the incident. There was nothing. The obituary spoke of Alamein, of D-Day, of the Rhine. It called him difficult. It called him brilliant. It called him vain. It did not mention the map room. It did not mention the 11,000 men of the 7th Armoured Division. It did not mention the Cuban cigar smoke, or the silence after Churchill's aircraft lifted off, or the expression on Montgomery's face that Henderson had never been able to name. Henderson set down the newspaper. He was 74 years old now. Elizabeth had been dead for 3 years. The garden had grown wild. He thought about writing a letter to the Times. He thought about explaining what he had seen, what it had meant, what it should mean to history. But when he picked up his pen, he found he still didn't have the words. In 1989, a military historian named Philip Warner published a biography of Montgomery. He had access to private papers, to letters, to documents that had been sealed for 40 years. On page 247, there was a single paragraph about the meeting of August 14th, 1944. It quoted from a letter Montgomery had written to his son David in 1952. "There are moments in command when you must choose between your career and your conscience. I have made that choice exactly once. I do not regret it. But I cannot explain it either. Not to Winston, not to the historians, not even to myself. Some decisions are simply made. Afterwards, you live with them. That is all." Henderson was dead by then. He never saw the paragraph. He never knew that Montgomery, too, had found himself unable to explain. The 7th Armored Division was disbanded in 1958. The men who had served in it scattered across Britain, across the Commonwealth, across the world. Most of them never knew how close they had come in August 1944. Most of them never knew about the map room or the cigar smoke or the 11 minutes Montgomery had stood alone after Churchill's aircraft lifted off. They only knew that they had survived, that they had gone home, that they had lived their lives. There is something worth sitting with in that arithmetic. 11,000 men, one general, one refusal. The numbers do not capture what was at stake, which is perhaps why Henderson could never find the words, and why Montgomery could only say that some decisions are simply made. The language of military history, flanks, breakouts, casualty estimates, was built to describe what happened. It was not built to describe what did not happen. The trucks that did not burn, the letters that did not arrive, the gardens that did not go untended. Historians have spent decades arguing about Montgomery. The arguments tend to cluster around the same axes. Was he too cautious? Did his operational patience shade into timidity at critical moments? Did his refusal to take risks in Normandy cost the Allies weeks they could not afford? These are real questions, and serious people have made serious arguments on both sides. But there is a tendency in these arguments to evaluate commanders purely on the basis of what they achieved, to treat the men under their command as instruments of the achievement rather than as the thing being protected. Montgomery was guilty of many of the faults attributed to him. He was arrogant. He was politically tone-deaf in ways that cost the alliance real friction at moments when friction was costly. He could be vain about credit and petty about blame. But on this question, the question of whether it was acceptable to spend men carelessly in service of political deadlines, he was consistent in a way that the historical record supports. He had seen Passchendaele. He had seen what happened when the relationship between military authority and the lives of soldiers was reduced to arithmetic, when the question of whether to send another division forward was answered by the theory that the enemy must eventually run out of soldiers too. He had made a private decision somewhere in the mud of the Western Front, as a young officer watching things that no young officer should have to watch, that if he ever had the authority to prevent such waste, he would use it, regardless of the cost to himself. In August 1944, near the Belgian border, he used it. But here's what we know. In the autumn of 1942, a man looked at a map covered in the positions of other men, listened to the most powerful voice in Britain demand something he believed to be wrong, and said no. Not because he was certain of success, not because he had calculated the odds, but because he understood that authority over lives is not the same thing as ownership of lives, and that the men in those map positions were not his to spend carelessly, regardless of who was asking. Montgomery was not a sentimental man. The veterans who served under him remembered someone who was exacting, demanding, not given to warmth. He did not tell the men of the 7th Armoured that he was protecting them. He simply did it in the way that a good commander does things, quietly, decisively, at personal cost, and without expecting anyone to understand why. This is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about him, that the most important decision of his career was one he made when he thought no one was watching, in defense of men he would never personally know, against pressure he had every rational reason to yield to. That Henderson stood there and witnessed it, and spent 30 years unable to explain it, tells us something important, not about Henderson's powers of expression, which were considerable, but about the nature of certain acts. Some things resist language not because they are confused, but because they are clear, because they point at something in human conduct that we recognize as right before we have the vocabulary to say why. We recognize it in the same way we recognize the things Sergeant Wilkins was trying to describe from his hospital bed in 1944, writing to his wife about how close they had come to being thrown away. He did not have the word for it either. He only knew that something had been different under Montgomery, that there had been a quality to the command he had not experienced before and would spend years trying to articulate. What he was articulating, without knowing it, was the experience of being led by someone who treated the fact of your life as a constraint on decision-making, rather than a resource to be consumed. It is a rarer quality in commanders than it should be. And in 1942 in the North African desert, when Churchill's impatience was pressing hard against Montgomery's refusal, it was the quality that mattered most. The smoke from Churchill's cigar had long since dissipated. But somewhere, in the silence between what happened and what could have happened, 11,000 men had kept breathing. And in villages and towns across Britain, for decades afterward, there were men who grew old in their gardens and watched their grandchildren and did not know, could not know, what quiet decision had been made on their behalf one August evening in a tent near the Belgian border. They had no way of knowing. That was precisely the point. Montgomery never claimed credit for it. He wrote once that some decisions are simply made. That is perhaps as close as he could come to explaining the thing that Henderson spent his life trying to describe. The decision was made. The men came home. The gardens were tended. That is all. That is enough.